before she was a queen, she was just a little girl in Detroit, a girl who carried pain in her heart and power in her voice. She didn't know it yet, but that voice would one day carry a nation through its darkest nights. Detroit, 1940s. The city roared with the sound of factories, car engines, and the heavy rhythm of steel. But inside New Bethel Baptist Church, there was another sound, a sound that rose above the noise of the city. It came from a little girl named Aretha. Her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, was already a legend in his own right, known as a $1,000,000 voice. His sermons filled the church with thunder. He was powerful, respected, feared, and admired. People traveled across states just to hear him preach. But in the shadow of his pulpit, a child stood quietly, watching, listening, absorbing every word, every note. Aretha's world was not gentle. Her mother, Barbara, left the family when Aretha was just 6. 2 years later, Barbara died. The girl who would one day be crowned Queen of Soul grew up with a wound that never fully healed. She sang not just because she wanted to, but because she needed to. Music became her comfort, her mother's arms, her secret prayer. In the living room of their home, gospel greats would visit. Mahalia Jackson, Clara Ward, Sam Cooke. They were not just stars. They were family friends, voices that filled the Franklin household with a kind of magic. Imagine being a child, sitting in the corner, while the giant of gospel played piano, clapped their hands, and let their voices soar. That was Aretha's childhood. By the time she was 10, she was already singing in church. The congregation would fall silent when she opened her mouth. Her voice wasn't just pretty. It was raw, powerful, and oh, beyond her years. When Aretha sang, people cried. They felt something ancient, something divine. Even grown men left the church trembling, whispering, "That little girl, she carries God in her throat." But childhood wasn't just church and song. It was also loneliness. Nights when she lay awake, missing the mother she barely knew. Days when her father's fame and strict rules left her feeling small and forgotten. She was a child forced to grow up too fast, and the pain of that childhood would stay with her forever. And yet in that pain, her voice was forged. Each loss, each ache, each lonely night became fuel for the sound that would later shake the world. Aretha Franklin didn't know it then, but she wasn't just singing gospel. She was training for battle, a battle against racism, against sexism, against a world that underestimated her. The Queen of Soul was still just a child, but already in Detroit's churches, the first notes of her reign had begun. From gospel to the big stage, she had grown up in the shadows of a pulpit, her voice carrying the sorrow of a child and the fire of a preacher. But the church walls could no longer contain her. Aretha Franklin was about to step beyond gospel into a world that would test her, break her, and ultimately transform her into a legend. The Franklin household was no ordinary home. Reverend C.L. Franklin's booming sermons and political influence made him a national figure, a voice in the growing civil rights movement. Civil rights leaders, gospel icons, and activists filled their living room. Martin Luther King Jr. himself would sit at their table. To young Aretha, these were not just guests. They were models of what a voice could do. A voice could move people. A voice could shake a nation. A voice could demand change. But for all the inspiration inside her home, Aretha carried wounds that fame and visitors could not heal. Her mother's absence left a void, and the world outside reminded her every day that she was a poor, black girl in a country still chained by segregation. At just 12 years old, she became a mother herself. The responsibility of raising a child as a child weighed heavy on her. But Aretha never let her voice falter. In fact, it only grew stronger. By the time she was a teenager, people already spoke of her as if she were destined for greatness. Mahalia Jackson, the Queen of Gospel, called her a gift from God. Her father believed she could be more than a church singer. He began managing her, guiding her towards something bigger. Aretha took her first steps out of the church and into the recording studio in the late 1950s. She was still just a teenager when Columbia Records signed her. To many, it was a fulfillment of her destiny. The preacher's daughter with the angelic voice, now standing at the door of stardom. But destiny is never simple. At Columbia, producers didn't know what to do with her. They dressed her in strings and jazz arrangements, tried to mold her into another Ella Fitzgerald, another Billie Holiday. The records were good, but they weren't Aretha. Her soul, her fire, her raw gospel power was buried under polished pop. Audiences listened politely, but they didn't feel the earth shake. The industry began to whisper, maybe she's just another church girl who couldn't cross over. But Aretha wasn't finished. In smoky clubs in Detroit, New York, and Chicago, she performed live, singing with a freedom she wasn't allowed in the studio. There, she stripped off the strings and let the church come roaring back through her. People left those clubs stunned. They said her voice could break glass, could raise the dead, could burn through pain itself. And through those nights, Aretha began to understand something. Stardom wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It was about breaking it. She was tired being told what she should sound like, who she should be. She wasn't just a jazz singer. She wasn't just a gospel girl. She was something else, something new. And soon, she would find a place, the sound, and the songs that would unleash the full force of her gift. Because Aretha Franklin was not meant to follow anyone else's path. She was meant to create her own. The big stage was waiting, and when she finally stepped onto it, the world would never be the same again. Finding her sound the Atlantic years, she had been dismissed, overlooked, and nearly forgotten. But destiny has a way of waiting. When Aretha Franklin walked into a small studio in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, she didn't just record a song. She found her voice, and with it, she found her crown. The early 1960s were hard for Aretha. Columbia Records had promised her a world, but gave her chains instead. They dressed her in fancy gowns, sat her at a piano, and wrapped her voice in strings and orchestrations that muffled her fire. The result? Albums that critics called pleasant, but no one called unforgettable. Behind the scenes, Aretha was restless. She knew what she could do. She knew the raw thunder of gospel still lived in her chest. But every time she tried to unleash it, producers shook their heads. Too churchy, too rough, too risky. By 1966, Columbia let her go. To many, that was the end of Aretha's chance at stardom. She was 24, with children to raise, a struggling marriage, and a career that seemed destined to vanish. But the Queen of Soul was not built for silence. That year, Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records saw what others didn't. He believed Aretha wasn't meant to be polished. She was meant to burn. Wexler brought her to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to record with the Swampers, a group of white Southern musicians who knew how to play soul with grit. And there, in that tiny studio, magic happened. Aretha sat at the piano, nervous, almost doubtful. But when her fingers touched the keys and her voice broke free, the room changed. The musicians stopped playing, stunned by the force pouring out of her. They weren't just backing a singer, they were witnessing a storm. The song was I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You. From the first note, it was undeniable. This was not the polite, restrained Aretha of Columbia. This was a woman testifying, crying, demanding to be heard. It was gospel in the body of soul, pain wrapped in fire. When the track was released in 1967, it exploded. Suddenly, Aretha Franklin was everywhere. Her voice poured out of radios across America, reaching people in ways they had never felt before. For black audiences, she was a sister, a daughter, a warrior. For white audiences, she was a revelation. But this was only the beginning. Later that same year, she recorded Respect. Originally a song by Otis Redding, it was good in his hands. But in Aretha's, it became something else, something revolutionary. She didn't just sing it, she owned it. She spelled it out, demanded it, turned it into an anthem. R-E-S-P-E-C-T. It was more than a chorus. It was a battle cry. Women heard it and felt power. Black America heard it and felt pride. The civil rights movement heard it and felt strength. With one song, Aretha Franklin had given voice to a nation's demands. Otis Redding himself admitted, "That girl stole my song." He wasn't bitter. He was in awe. because Aretha had transformed it into something eternal. In a matter of months, Aretha Franklin went from near obscurity to superstardom. Her albums at Atlantic, Lady Soul, Aretha Now, Spear in the Dark weren't just records, they were declarations. Songs like Chain of Fools, Think, Natural Woman became cultural landmarks. And through it all, Aretha never forgot where she came from. No matter how big the stage, no matter how bright the lights, she carried the church with her. Every riff, every growl, every soaring note was born from pews, pulpits, and prayer. By 1968, she wasn't just a star, she was a star, the queen of soul. And unlike Columbia's manufactured image, this title wasn't given to her. She had taken it. She had claimed it with her voice, her pain, her fire. But greatness is never easy. Fame brought pressure. Pressure from the industry, from family, from the public, who wanted her to be more than just a singer. They wanted her to be a symbol, a leader, a queen. And Aretha, still so young, still carrying scars from childhood, still struggling in her private life, had to decide, could she carry not just her own pain but the weight of a nation? The answer would come to streets, in marches, and in the cries for freedom. Because Aretha Franklin was about to discover that her crown was not just for music, it was for justice. Respect, the anthem of a movement. It wasn't just a song, it was a demand, a prayer, a revolution wrapped in melody. When Aretha Franklin sang the word respect, she didn't just sing for herself. She sang for every woman, every Black American, every soul that had ever been silenced. The country was on fire. Cities erupted with protests. The Vietnam War tore through families, and the civil rights movement raged in the streets. America was a nation divided by race, by gender, by fear. And in the middle of the storm, a woman from Detroit picked up a microphone and lit a match. Respect. Otis Redding had written it, but it was never truly his, in his version. It was a plea of a man asking his woman to honor him. But when Aretha Franklin sang it, when she spelled it out, when her sisters Irma and Carolyn shouted the backup lines like a choir of revolutionaries, it became something else entirely. RESPECT, find out what it means to me. It was no longer about one man. It was about everyone who had ever been denied dignity. It was a chant for women told to stay silent, for Black Americans told to stay in their place, for the powerless demanding to be seen. When the record hit the airwaves, it didn't just climb the charts, it detonated. Across America, people blasted it from radios, sang it in protest, shouted it in living rooms. Feminists claimed it. Civil rights leaders embraced it. Young girls whispered it in their mirrors, finally seeing themselves in a world that tried to erase them. Aretha herself said it was more than a hit. It was her testimony. She wasn't just performing a song. She was standing on behalf of every woman who had ever been overlooked, every Black voice that had ever been drowned out. With every syllable, she demanded the respect she had been denied her entire life. And the world listened. It wasn't just that the song topped the charts. It became a weapon, a shield, a unifying cry that crossed boundaries. College campuses sang it. Marches echoed it. Even in the White House, people couldn't ignore it. The anthem of a movement had been born, and its queen stood at the microphone. But respect on the stage didn't always mean respect at home. Behind the scenes, Aretha still fought private battles, the troubled marriage, the heavy demands of fame, the loneliness that even applause couldn't erase. The irony was sharp. She gave the world its greatest anthem of power, yet she herself still struggled to hold on to her own peace. Still, the song changed everything. Aretha Franklin wasn't just a singer anymore. She was a symbol, a voice that could not be ignored, a woman who carried the pain of her people and transformed it into something eternal. And as the 1960s marched on, her music would no longer just be entertainment. It would become history. Because Aretha Franklin didn't just sing about freedom. She became the sound of it. The civil rights singer. Politicians gave speeches, preachers gave sermons, but Aretha Franklin gave something no one else could, a voice that carried hope, anger, and freedom all at once. She wasn't just the queen of soul. She became the soundtrack of a revolution. The 1960s burned hot. Across America, marches filled the streets. Fists rose in the air, and the fight for equality shook the foundations of the nation. At the center of it all stood Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and right beside him, often just a step away, was a young woman whose weapon was not protest signs or fiery speeches, but song. Aretha Franklin didn't just support the movement from afar. She lived inside it. Her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, had been close to King for years. The Franklin home had become a meeting ground for activists, strategists, and preachers who were shaping history. Aretha grew up in that atmosphere. She understood from a young age that a voice could do more than entertain. It could inspire, it could protect, it could ignite. By the late 1960s, Aretha was donating money, performing at fundraisers, and lending her stage to the cause. When the Southern Christian Leadership Conference needed support, she gave it. When protesters needed encouragement, she sang. She didn't just sing for audiences in clubs and theaters. She sang for freedom fighters preparing to march into danger. Her music became fuel. Respect. Thing. Chain of Fools. Each song carried double meaning. To some, they were hits to dance to, but to those in the struggle, they were codes, affirmations, reminders of strength. When Aretha sang, "You better think about what you're trying to do to me," the civil rights movement heard something deeper, a refusal to be broken. Then came 1968. Tragedy struck. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. The nation collapsed into grief and rage. In that dark hour, Aretha's voice rose higher than ever. She sang at benefits, at rallies, at vigils. When the people needed to cry, she gave them sorrow. When they needed courage, she gave them fire. And when they needed hope, she gave them gospel. FBI agents wrote her name into surveillance files, marking her as a potential threat. Not because she carried weapons, but because she carried influence. They feared the power of her music, the way she could command a crowd, the way her voice slipped past barriers that bullets and batons could not. In Detroit, in Chicago, in the South, her songs played like hymns of defiance. She became, unofficially but undeniably, the voice of the civil rights movement. But the burden was heavy. Fame pressed down on her. Expectations piled high. And at home, her personal life crumbled. Failed relationships, the demands of motherhood, the weight of being the queen to millions. It nearly crushed her. Still, she stood. Still, she sang. Because she knew her voice was bigger than herself. Aretha Franklin wasn't just making music anymore. She was making history. And the world would never hear a gospel note or a soul riff the same way again. The Queen of Soul, fame and pressure. She had the crown, the voice, the fame. To the world, she was untouchable, the Queen of Soul. But behind the curtain, Aretha Franklin was fighting battles the audience never saw. Because even a queen can be broken by the weight of her throne. By the 1970s, Aretha Franklin was everywhere. Her songs dominated the charts. Her record sold millions. And her face appeared on the covers of Time and Rolling Stone. When people said the Queen of Soul, there was no debate. She was not just a singer. She was an empire. Her concerts became spiritual experiences. Crowds didn't just listen to Aretha. They surrendered to her. When she sang, "You make me feel like a natural woman," the air changed. Women cried. Men held their breath. It wasn't performance. It was revelation. But fame, as it always does, carried a price. In private, Aretha's world was far less glamorous. She battled broken marriages, turbulent relationships, and the endless demands of being a single mother. Her first marriage to Ted White had been stormy, scarred by control and conflict. Though she eventually broke free, the wounds lingered. Later, she found love again, but stability always seemed just out of reach. And then there was the pressure of the industry. Every label executive, every manager, every critic wanted more from her. More hits, more tours, more of herself. Poured out endlessly. The very voice that healed millions sometimes left her exhausted, gasping, wondering if she belonged to herself at all. Aretha also struggled with self-doubt. For all her power on stage, she was fragile off it. Food, alcohol, and later health issues became quiet battles. Tabloids pounced on her weight, her personal troubles, her flaws. They crowned her queen one day and tore her down the next. But Aretha was never one to bow. On stage, she wore her pain like armor. Each heartbreak bled into her songs, turning personal wounds into universal hymns. When she belted Ain't No Way or Don't Play That Song, she wasn't just singing lyrics, she was confessing, demanding, surviving. The 1970s also brought new challenges in music. Funk, disco, and rock took over the airwaves. Some critics wondered if Aretha could keep her throne in a world that was moving on. But she reminded them, queens don't beg for a crown. They keep it. Her albums, Young, Gifted in Black, and Sparkle proved she could evolve. She recorded with Curtis Mayfield, worked with new producers, and kept her sound alive. The Grammys piled up. Awards lined her shelves. She remained the voice of her people. Yet at home, the silence was heavy. She still longed for the one thing fame couldn't give her: peace. To the world, Aretha Franklin was invincible. But behind the spotlight, she was still the little girl from Detroit, scarred, searching, and carrying the weight of every note she sang. And soon, the 1980s would come. A new generation would rise. And the Queen of Soul would face the unthinkable, proving herself all over again. Reinvention and legacy. They said her reign was over, that the Queen of Soul belonged to another time. But Aretha Franklin wasn't done. Because legends don't retire, they rise again, and they remind the world why they were crowned in the first place. The late 1970s had been turbulent. Disco ruled the charts, rock dominated arenas, and critics whispered that Aretha's era was fading. Younger artists filled the radio, and even some of her loyal fans wondered if the Queen of Soul had given her final bow. But queens do not fade. They fight. And in the 1980s, Aretha Franklin fought her way back to the throne. Her rebirth came with a new home, Arista Records. Under Clive Davis's guidance, she reinvented her sound for a new generation without losing her soul. The music was fresher, sharper, pulsing with the energy of the times. Yet every note still carried the gospel fire that had made her immortal. In 1985, Uzuman Who took the world by storm. Songs like Freeway of Love and the title track lit up MTV, putting Aretha alongside artists half her age. For the first time, her music videos played on the same screens as Madonna and Michael Jackson. Young fans who hadn't grown up with respect now danced to the Queen of Soul cruising in a pink Cadillac. Her resurgence was more than just chart success. It was vindication. Aretha was no relic. She was timeless. She collaborated with stars like George Michael, Annie Lennox, and Whitney Houston, bridging generations, showing the world that her crown was secure. Each duet was proof. No matter how powerful the other voice, Aretha's cut through with unmatched authority. She didn't compete. She commanded. Awards followed her everywhere. Grammys, Lifetime Achievements, inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where she became the very first woman ever honored. Presidents invited her to sing. World leaders sought her presence. She wasn't just the Queen of Soul. She was America's voice. And yet, she never abandoned her roots. Even in the peak of her renewed fame, she returned again and again to gospel. In 1972, her Amazing Grace album had already cemented her as the greatest gospel singer of her generation. By the 1980s and beyond, she carried that same spirit into every stage she graced, reminding the world that before the fame, before the titles, before the crown, she was a child of the church. Her legacy grew not just through records, but through resilience. She proved that no matter the age, no matter the trend, true artistry cannot be erased. By the end of the 1980s, Aretha Franklin had done the unthinkable. She had not only survived the storms of fame, she had outlasted them. She stood taller, prouder, freer. And yet, even as she celebrated triumph after triumph, time was waiting. The 1990s and beyond would test her body, her health, her spirit. But the Queen of Soul would sing until her very last breath, because Aretha Franklin was not just a woman. She was a legacy, and that legacy was still being written. The last song, A Nation Says Goodbye, even as her body grew weak, her voice remained unshakable. The Queen of Soul refused to leave the stage quietly, and in her final years, Aretha Franklin reminded the world one last time why legends never die. The 1990s and 2000s brought both glory and struggle. Aretha Franklin's legacy was already cemented. The Grammys, a Hall of Fame, the anthems that had reshaped America. But time is relentless, even for queens. Her health faltered, her body slowed, but her spirit never bent. She continued to perform, often against doctors' orders, sometimes stepping on stage moments after being too ill to rehearse. Her managers, her family, her doctors all told her to rest. But Aretha knew something they didn't. A queen doesn't rest. A queen reigns until her last breath. In 2009, at the inauguration of Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, she sang My Country, 'Tis of Thee, dressed in a gray coat and the now iconic oversized bow hat. She delivered more than performance. She delivered history. For a girl born in segregated America, for a child who had sung in her father's church when civil rights was still a dream, to stand on that stage, it was a circle completed. Tears rolled down the faces of millions. Her voice cracked with age, but carried with it decades of pain, triumph, and survival. It wasn't perfection. It was something greater. It was truth. But perhaps her most unforgettable moment came in 2015 at the Kennedy Center Honors. Carole King was being celebrated, and Aretha stepped onto the stage to sing. You make me feel like a natural woman, draped in a fur coat. She sat at the piano and began to play. From the very first note, the room changed. Celebrities gasped. Musicians shook their heads in disbelief, and President Obama himself was seen wiping tears from his eyes. When she reached the climax of the song, throwing off her coat and standing with a power that defied age, the crowd rose to their feet. It wasn't just applause. It was worship. It was Aretha Franklin's final gift to the world. Just 3 years later, in 2018, the Queen of Soul passed away in Detroit at the age of 76. The news shook the globe. Vigils were held. Fans gathered outside her church. World leaders, musicians, presidents, and millions of ordinary people mourned as if they had lost a family member. Her funeral was a royal procession, a gold casket, a parade of pink Cadillacs lining the streets, a service that lasted hours, filled with gospel, tears, and testimony. Even in death, she was larger than life. But here's the truth. Aretha Franklin never really left. Her voice still echoes in radios, in marches, in weddings and funerals, in protests. When someone demands dignity, they still sing respect. When someone searches for love, they still turn to a natural woman. When a nation needs comfort, it still finds her in amazing grace. The Queen of Soul did not belong to one generation. She belongs to all of them. And as the final curtain fell, America whispered back the only tribute worthy of her name. Thank you, Aretha, for giving us freedom in every note you sang. Asterisk, Aretha Franklin's story is not just about music. It's about survival. It's about a little girl who lost a mother too soon, who grew up with scars too deep for most to carry, and yet she turned that pain into power. Her voice became the hymn of a generation, the anthem of a movement, the prayer of a nation. She sang for respect. She sang for freedom. She sang for love. And in doing so, she gave her voice to everyone who had none. Even when her body weakened, her spirit remained unshakable. Because queens don't surrender their crowns, not in life, not in death. And so, the Queen of Soul still reigns. In every protest chant, in every whispered prayer, in every song that demands dignity, Aretha Franklin will always be with us. If this story touched you, if you felt her fire and her fight, join us. Subscribe to our channel and walk with us as we bring more silent stories back to life. The stories of legends, of voices that refuse to be forgotten because their songs never end. And neither does the truth. Asterisk.